So I'm going to be talking about behavioral science and driving rooftop solar adoption. And I'll start at the beginning. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes and then hand it over to Gordon. And I'll start at the beginning here. The big picture is what influences the speed and effects of an energy transition is kind of one of the motivating questions of my work. And the primary goal of this talk right now is to provide some insights into the drivers of pro-social behavior. And I like thinking about how can we leverage our understanding of behavior and how people respond to interventions that influence behavior to navigate a low-cost and equitable transition to a low-carbon future. And these are sort of my motivating questions and a large fraction of my own research. And a lot of this began when I was a PhD student working with my co-author, Brian Bollinger. We were sitting for coffee, meeting up. We're both PhD students. He's a quantitative marketer, and I'm an economist. And I had been working on solar installations and thinking about the demand for solar to try and look at solar policy, and had plotted these plots that you see. And was just really intrigued by the clustering that we saw. And I was, I was talking to Brian. I had my laptop there. I pulled open the laptop and I showed him these pictures, and he's like, "Well, those look like pure effects." And in the quantitative marketing literature, they'd really been starting to identify and look at pure effects. Turns out in economics, of course, they also have been working on pure effects for quite some time, where pure effects are basically saying if your peers adopt, you're more likely to adopt the technology. And that can lead to clustering. So you have one point to drop down in a certain spot, and then other points cluster around it. And the interesting thing about it here is we have the shading, in which the shading is the density of population. We could also shade it by income. These clusters don't always match income. They don't always match population density. They don't always match even environmental preferences alone. They fall in these very interesting patterns. And so we were intrigued by this and thought, let's explore it. We want to know why there could be such clustering. It could be just everyone who's environmental lives in the same place, environmentally oriented lives in the same place, and is more likely to adopt rooftop solar. Another could be there's just a higher density of owner-occupied homes in the area. So if there are more homes, there's going to be more solar. Could be that some areas are wealthier than others, and wealthier areas perhaps are more likely, or it turns out actually the very highest income, they're less likely, but at a higher income, more likely to adopt solar adoption. Or social interactions may play a role. Visibility, word of mouth, peer pressure, all of these could play a role. And there you see the person looking over their neighbor's fence line to see solar over there. But broadly, we're thinking about situations where word of mouth, peer pressure, visibility changes a social norm in a particular area. And when you're thinking about clustering of the panels, of solar panels in an area, you're really thinking about it in terms of neighbor effects. Is the type of peer effect is a neighbor effect. We felt that finding a causal effect is essential. So just because there's clustering, it could be any of these hypotheses. And so finding a causal social interaction effect is really important, but it requires a careful research design to address potential confounding factors, including some of the ones that we just mentioned there. Correlated unobservable, so income and density, like I mentioned. Turns out that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that there could be some simultaneity or reflection in that I affect you and you affect me. And so if we both are making a decision at the same time, we're both affecting each other. And that could influence whether you're quantifying a real causal social influence effect or not. And another one is self-selection of peers. A whole bunch of people who are environmentally minded and solar minded tend to want to live in the same place. That's also known as homophily, which that's just the technical term for birds of a feather flock together, basically, which is something we've all known that does occur. And so you have to kind of design a study to deal with these issues. And so a lot of my work has developed new approaches for estimating these causal effects in pro-environmental contexts, and solar PV has really been the dominant one. So I'll use a whole set of particular variables and controls to demonstrate causal peer effects. And I want to mention kind of on the bottom right here is an example of what we call a spatiotemporal variable, where we'll look at the neighbors. So you have a house here, and these red dots are all neighbors who have adopted since 2005, and green dots are within 12 months. And what you kind of can see is you can create a variable for the people who are around a given household and understand the influence that they have, so that if there are more neighbors who are around a given household and previously adopted before them, is that household more likely to adopt? And this one is in the Journal of Economic Geography. But this work kind of built a body of knowledge that, at least within solar PV, we were seeing some very clear peer effects. That was a peer effects in the diffusion of solar photovoltaic panels. Turns out they actually extend beyond solar PV. This talk's really about solar PV, but it's kind of fun to think about other areas as well. And one of the first studies to demonstrate peer effects was in water conservation. So here we used a machine learning classification approach in Phoenix, Arizona, which is a very dry place, much drier than here in Connecticut, to look at whether these green areas and the transition from these green areas to drier landscapes could be exhibiting a peer effect as well. So we leveraged people who moved into a peer group and changed their landscaping. But the result is, if your neighbors reduce their water use, you will too. And they reduce their water use through xeriscaping. Xeriscaping is the word that people use for putting out dry land landscaping, putting out succulents and other cacti, which people will do. But why are these important? So these peer effects are important because they influence the spatial patterns of adoption. And it also may be possible to leverage them to increase adoption. They can also increase adoption by household and vulnerable communities. You could target vulnerable or underrepresented communities, which you may be interested. And then from my perspective, I just have to throw this in that I think thinking about contagion in solar panels is just fun. This has been picked up by a variety of different of magazines and newspapers, like Neighbors Solar Panels. Google's new product puts peer pressure to a sunny use, or behavioral contagion could spread the benefits of a carbon tax. One of the interesting things about this is especially if you can leverage them, but even just understanding that they can have an impact could influence the design of behavioral interventions and could also influence the speed at which you can have adoption of these new technologies. So I've done a lot of work on leveraging peer effects. So once we discovered that there are peer effects, it was more interesting to me to start thinking about, can you develop community-based interventions to leverage social interactions? And can they work? So I've run a series of field experiments funded by the US Department of Energy. And at the core of these is a Solarize campaign. It was a limited time grassroots volunteer-led campaign with a town-chosen solar company and group pricing. So it's this mix of different things, a bundle of different things together. These are just some pictures. There'd be town hall meetings, there would be open houses, and then get people excited. They put up signs, and the town would work together. When this is happening, it's fascinating. What are the important influences for the decision to install solar? Strongly agree. Well, town events and solar ambassadors. Solar ambassadors were people who worked with this campaign to really try and tell their friends about solar. So two things that are directly from here. And then seeing solar is number 3. So visibility matters, and we've explored this more, as well as recommendations from someone in your town or recommendations from a friend or neighbor are also really up there. All of these are social. All of these are really things that are, before you even get to the installer or print media or manufacturer, all of these are social aspects that really play a role in behavior. And the Solarize definitely worked. It led to massive increases in adoption and even some lower prices during the campaigns. So the gray area is the area of the campaigns. And then we see this huge jump in the campaigns. And we actually see a little bit here. It looks like they're about parallel, but we followed them afterwards. And in general, there's a little bit of an increase afterwards from, you can think about it as seeding. You put a bunch of seeds down, and then that leads to further peer effects, which leads to further installations afterwards. which was pretty neat. So and it turns out it's actually also pretty cost effective from a governmental perspective if the goal is a certain number of solar installations. And so that's a management science paper I have on social learning and solar photovoltaic adoption. And I like to show maps, so this is a fun thing. It'll be quite quick, but we can see this effect in the maps. The areas are where the blue are where solarized campaigns are occurring, and you can kind of see this is Connecticut where these adoptions are happening and how they've clustered and around a lot of the places that have had solarized campaigns. So it's really fun to look at. What made it effective? Well, volunteers are one reason, but what made them effective? In examining this, we provided the first empirical evidence of the theory's credibility-enhancing displays, and this is something that that Gordon is going to talk about more. And so I'm going to flip through that slide so allow Gordon to talk about that more. But can it reach low-income populations? We had a field experiment that tested this. We explored two messaging strategies, pro-social and self-interest. And self-interest messaging actually outperforms, but only for higher income towns. So for middle and lower income towns, the pro-social message, and by pro-social, I mean messaging saying, you know, look, solar is great for your community, solar is improving the environment, whereas the self-interest messaging was like, solar is going to save you money. And so the higher income towns is where solar is going to save you money actually was more effective, which was quite interesting. And the pro-social approach leads to greater recommendations and satisfaction with the installations. So what we saw was in total, the lower income towns and the higher income towns. And for lower income towns, pro-social and self-interest work pretty much, we can't distinguish between the two when we ran messaging strategies in towns of one versus the other. But they all did better than the control in general. And so this is a paper in the Proceedings of National Academies of Sciences showing that self-interest attracts more sunlight. This is the idea. So I want to finish in my 15 minutes, and I think I'm right there. So some big picture findings. Insights from behavioral economics can speed the adoption of low carbon technologies, in particular solar PV, often at a very low cost. And this is an area that can be leveraged going forward. And so I'm excited to talk in the Q&A as we move forward into how it works. I can talk more about visibility because we've done a lot of work on the importance of visibility and how we think about targeting when we think about some of these. But I don't want to take away any time from my esteemed colleague, Gordon Kraft Todd, who will be telling us more about his work and as well as some of our work together.